you sitting back trying to make sense of this? Because, of course, you see folks, especially folks who are writing in the popular press, that this feels like a second Civil War. This feels like the end of Reconstruction. This is an era of white backlash, or, your colleague Vesla Weaver in political science at Yale, a frontlash. How do you make sense of this as a historian, someone who's written and thought deeply about these issues?
We're all searching for analogies, and we were from the very beginning, and both for Trump as a character, but also the political phenomenon. And I think we have to go back to the other time that we were so divided, so polarized, so worried about institutions, to say the least. On the other hand, it's not yet a civil war. It's not yet 1861. No one has seceded from the Union just yet. And the voter turnout midterms shows us that voters were engaged, interested, and not seceding. Well, lots of people secede anyway because they just don't vote. The turnout in the midterms was encouraging. However, there's no question we have dysfunctional institutions. We have structures in the Constitution that either do not work or don't, frankly, make much modern sense, as in the Electoral College. And we have political parties that are struggling to organize persuasions, to organize people. And I said this in print before, in op-eds and so forth. Watch what happens to the political parties, because even though lots of people don't particularly like political parties, and millions now identify as independents, whatever that means to them, if our political parties disintegrate, splinter, fall apart, no longer provide political organization by which we define ourselves. If that happens, then our particular kind of system is in deep trouble. We don't have a parliamentary system. We don't share power in the government or in Congress between 3, 4, 5, 6 different parties. We've lived all of these years with an essentially two-party system, with the rare occasion that a third one slips in, wins something here or there. But when those institutions disintegrate, then we will be in very deep trouble. But that's one way of looking at the present based on the past.
To the midterm. So certainly we have the gerrymandering, certainly have voter suppression. Some of those ads against Abrams down there in Georgia, that was right out of George Wallace in the 50s and the 60s, calling her a communist, these robocalls. And you have folks writing editorials saying, okay, we have two problems you point out. We have the Electoral College, which overrepresents the interests of slaveholding states for all intents and purposes. And we have a Senate that gives disproportionate power to rural parts of the country, empty states, as they say. So on one hand, I can say, yes, America's democracy is a racialized democracy from the founding. Yes, the Constitution is a living document. We can change, we can adapt. But I get nervous when I hear folks talking about changing the Senate, for example, or tearing down the Electoral College. How can you help me work through that anxiety?
I don't think you should be anxious about taking down the Electoral College. On the other hand, it isn't going to happen. We can complain about it. It isn't going to happen because it takes a constitutional amendment. That just is not on the horizon because small states will never approve it. The Republican Party at this point would never be for it because they have an electoral strategy in general elections that makes them dependent on it in many ways. We have 2 Republican presidents in very recent history who did not win popular votes but became presidents. They're not going to go against that. So you can put that anxiety aside. On the other hand, your anxiety about the Senate and breaking apart an institution is important. I mean, you could say the U.S. Senate, when it has worked effectively, when it has had real bipartisan leaders over the years, over the generations, was a source of validity and stability, 2 from each state and so forth and so on. But that isn't what we have anymore. We haven't had it for some time. And the numbers, I forget the exact numbers now, but what is it that pretty soon 30% of the people are going to have 70% of the senators? And that's not exactly democracy. Senate as an institution wasn't terribly democratic from the beginning. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to be the branch of Congress that represented the elite, the higher parts of hierarchies. Perhaps it still does in that sense, because you got to win statewide. So I don't know, but it is not a very democratic institution. Deeper down, what I think frustrates so many of us, so many people, frankly, reasonable people, is that we once again have a serious voting rights problem. Way over a half century after the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s and the Voting Rights Act. And we have a completely transparent attempt by one political party to suppress the votes of people who don't vote for them. It's patently obvious what's been going on in many states, not just in this election. This goes back 10, 12, and more years. This started during Bush years. So, and how we solve that? Well, there's structural issues there too. A national holiday for voting would be one start. Less states' rights, enforcement of election days, and more national standards. I would be all for a federal national standard about how we conduct elections and how we register people to vote. Same-day registration, why not? Everywhere, nationwide. Do it on a Sunday or do it on a Monday that's a total holiday. But it would have to be a real holiday. The entire service economy wouldn't still have to be working because we all want our shops open even when there's a holiday. You'd have to be serious. What we don't have, though, we simply don't. This is a fact. We don't have a bipartisan commitment to maximizing the right to vote. We just don't. And there's no way we can see that on the horizon because it is not in the interest of the Republican Party to maximize the right to vote in the United States. That's a structural problem. But you can only legislate it by the legislature. You can only do this in Congress. So I suppose it's possible, if the Democrats got control of both houses again, that some of these things might be attempted. But which parts of them would have to be constitutional amendments and which could simply be laws is another question. At the end of the day, which I think you've already suggested, it's the question of faith in elections and faith in voting and in the democratic process, faith in democracy itself that actually is ultimately at stake. And, look, this is a great experiment that's been around way over 200 years now, almost 250 pretty soon. We've only amended the thing 20-some times. In all reason, got 2 or 3 constitutional amendments that ought to happen. However, politics is not necessarily there to do it. And hence, we just limp along. We repeat this problem over and over and over.
How do we locate, the long Black freedom struggle, and African Americans' unique relationship to democracy with trying to renew American democracy in the present? So on one hand, I don't want to say that, one group of folk have a special obligation to this country and have earned it in blood, but we have so much to learn from the Black freedom struggle. Then you got folks pushing back saying, well, that language itself is problematic. How do you specify it?
It's not a burden put on anybody. To call it the Black freedom struggle is to call it what it's been for 150, 160, 175 years. Go back to abolitionism. Frederick Douglass used to say that until the black man can vote, slavery is not dead. And he said that all through Reconstruction, we could say until black people are totally secure in voting, slavery is not dead. Slavery and its aftermath are not dead. Now, sometimes it is, as you just suggested, hard to pinpoint the blame here. Is it racism behind voter suppression alone? Or is it just political skullduggery? If that group of people doesn't vote for my side, I'm going to try to suppress their vote. Could be black people, brown people, young people, old people. Some of the suppression is simply against students generically, making it confusing for young people to vote, making it confusing or difficult for old people to vote. So sometimes it is racism, and that is exactly what it is. There's also a class argument.
The plutocrats, that goes back to the planter class in a lot of ways.
Sure it does. You can find the belief that some of us are educated enough to vote and some of us are not. Some are prepared for political participation and some are not. As if an unemployed single mother raising 3 kids doesn't have a political attitude or something. But there's no question that if you go back through this 175, 180 years of what we'll call the Black freedom struggle, through all of its various stages, if you look at every time that the United States Constitution has truly been altered, such as in the revolution of the 3 great Civil War amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th. Look ahead again to all the various litigation, the slow, methodical litigation by the NAACP and others that finally led to Brown v. Board. And there were many cases before that, 3 decades. And by the time you get to Brown v. Borden, and by the time you get a decade later to the 2 great Civil Rights Acts, the great changes in our Constitution have virtually all come because of race. That is, in the question of right. It's come because of advances, struggles, revolutions, crusades in the interest of maximizing the civil and political rights of African Americans, and then all of the other groups that have come along in their wake. such as gay rights and women's rights and American Indian rights back in the 60s and 70s and so on. So a simple survey of American history would simply show us, without emancipation, no 14th Amendment, no 13th and 14th Amendment, no equality before law and birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment, and no Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, because the 14th Amendment had been all but erased by court cases and by segregation and by terror and by violence all through the 80 to 90 years in between the 14th Amendment and the outbreak of the Civil Rights Movement. So Black freedom struggle is there, showing us all the markers by which this great experiment in democracy has been enhanced and advanced.
There's a piece in The Guardian, and you see these narratives, and I've written a few myself, so I put myself out there. Because, again, I'm just really trying to be self-conscious about the use and abuse of history. These narratives we grab onto because they seem catchy. You're like, that makes sense. But then on second viewing, you're like, I don't know. Basically saying, the Republican Party in this moment under Trumpism and before, we go back to the 1960s, but especially from Obama to now, that anti-Obama backlash really in a lot of ways feels like a new version of the Confederacy. And the person was writing about the neo-Confederates and their influence. But basically saying, white male-dominated planter class, updated for the 21st century, who are anti-democratic, who want to control black and brown people and women's bodies, and never mind the gun fetishism and the like, and anti-union attitudes. Do you think that's a fair comparison, or is that, again, holding myself accountable, is that just lazy writing?
Well, I saw that piece. Frankly, I'd be careful comparing Trumpism to the Confederacy itself, per se. The best comparison is to the tradition of white supremacy, and to the tradition of oligarchies, and in this case, a kind of a kleptocracy. But if what she or he was arguing is that white supremacy doesn't die, it revives in new forms, it revives sometimes in subtle forms, then yeah, Trumpism is about that. But it is not Confederacy in the sense that it's secessionist. It's not trying to form its own independent republic, at least certainly not yet. It doesn't really have this kind of we're going to leave you mentality. So we can put that part of it aside. However, some of its basic aim, some of its basic assumption that America ought to be a white person's country, a white people's country. And look, let's be honest about one thing here. The Republican Party was a white people's party before Donald Trump took it over. I mean, it already was, and it was becoming that a long time ago. And one of the things being lost here, our historical short-term memory or our historical ignorance, is that this kind of wedge politics, getting white people to the polls, dividing your electorate and getting your people there, which meant white people almost exclusively for Republicans, began during the Bush years. The only thing that was different then is that Bush did get a lot of Hispanic votes. And that had something to do with his roots in Texas. Clearly, it had something to do possibly even with the Bush family's connections to Hispanic America. But this kind of white, now we're calling it white nationalism. We didn't really call it that 10 years ago or more. But the Republicans have been the white party for a long time. And they became more and more so, of course, during the Obama years. And one of the things we can learn from this is, once again, over and over and over, every time we do have a major advance, and this is one of the things history clearly prepares you with, is to know that whenever there is a huge advance, and the election of a black president was extraordinary, it was revolutionary. He may or may not have turned out to be the kind of radical president people thought he was. He was a centrist liberal who, for God's sake, had to be president of the United States and couldn't always represent every liberal instinct that people had. On the other hand, the reaction to Obama, look what that has taught us. Every revolution has a counter-revolution. It always has. And part of what Trumpism is about, even though, it wasn't quite a majority movement, stunned us, surprised us all over the electorate, but it had its